Welcome to our HR Roundtable. Today, I am Shannon Latham, and I am taking over for Susan Wallace on these events. I want to welcome you all today. We actually have a full group today. As I kind of sent it out, Susan gave great directions, but we were having computer problems the day she taught me, and I unfortunately or fortunately sent it out to our entire chamber membership. So this one will be a little different, but I promise next month I will get it down. So I want to just go ahead and introduce quickly Mark Gash with our monthly sponsor with Qualified Plan Advisors. He's going to go ahead and give you talk briefly, and then we will turn it over to Angie.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's for those of you, can you hear me first of all?
They should be able to. I believe everybody is muted is the problem.
Great. All right. Well, for those of you I've not met, my name is Mark Gash with Qualified Plan Advisors. And for those of you I have met, I'm still Mark Gash with Qualified Plan Advisors. It's our pleasure to sponsor the HR Roundtable. We've been doing this for several years, and it's a joy to do. As our name suggests, we are a qualified retirement plan provider, and we provide fiduciary services and thoughtful education with the goal of providing superior participant outcomes. The firm is 30 years old. We have a talented investment advisory committee, approximately $10 billion in assets under management. We manage nearly 500 plans and have over 100 education-based advisors, 3 in-house ERISA attorneys, and over 25 accredited investment fiduciaries. We're headquartered locally, but we have 23 offices around the country and serve clients in all 50 states. We're going to be discussing bias in the workplace today. We encounter that too, although not quite in the same way we're going to discuss in a few minutes. In the qualified plan space, bias occurs in several forms. One of those forms is a kind of confirmation bias. And we encounter this with regard to automatic plan features. So in this case, confirmation bias refers to employees following the lead of their employer. For example, if an employer sets its automatic enrollment at 3%, most employees will contribute at 3%. If the employer sets its auto enrollment at 7%, employees tend to follow that lead as well and contribute at a rate of 7%. There's a similar effect with matching contributions. If an employer matches dollar for the first 3% of contributions and then 50 cents on the dollar up to 5%, employees tend to save 5%. So by using these kinds and matching them up with your particular needs, these types of unspoken confirmation bias, which an employer creates, can be used to create some very positive impacts on employee savings and improve their retirement outcomes. Automatic enrollment and contribution escalations can increase participation and contribution rates, allowing employers to fill that responsibility to their employees. And I can tell you that this is very much appreciated by employees. A recent study showed that participants with automatic enrollment and escalation features on their plan expressed support for those features at a rate of 97%. So if you haven't thought about those, please do. Call us and ask about, have us take a look at your plan and talk to you about how you can take advantage of those kinds of features. Another place where we encounter bias concerns plan trustee bias in fund selection. I see this a lot actually, and it's something you should avoid in your plan. When your plan trustee is a fund provider, trustee funds are more likely to be added to your plan, and studies show that that is often at a rate 50 times higher than unbiased mutual funds. Not only that, there's a tendency to push poorly performing funds, as well as a bias against removing trustee funds from a plan, even when they're poor performers in their peer groups. Poorly performing funds have a removal probability of about 30% if they're unbiased funds, but only 12% if they're trustee funds. All of that can create problems, as you might imagine. It affects the overall quality of a plan's fund lineup. It makes it harder to create quality diversification for people, and it can harm your investment performance. It can even lead sometimes to legal issues. There's been a boom in 401k lawsuits in the last few years. Qualified Plan Advisors is not a fund provider, and we have access to thousands of funds. We avoid these issues and build our lineups based solely on cost and performance measurements. So if you would, please allow us to take a look at your plan. If nothing else, if you're audited, you'll have something that says you had a third party look at it. But we can help you see if you can avoid these kinds of issues while at the same time adding personal touch service and high quality plan education. We'd be honored to help. Thanks for joining today. Please feel free to contact us if we can be of service.
Thank you, Mark. I am going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. We have Angela Pastorek. She is the program director and lead facility for the 4-course online graduate certificate and master's degree programs in the KU School of Professional Studies, based at the KU Edwards campus in Overland Park. Her teaching and research interests center around organizational culture and workplace socialization. She teaches a full range of graduate courses about organizational communication, including change management, communication, diversity and inclusion strategy, conflict management, virtual teams, and business writing and presentation skills. Prior to joining the KU faculty in 2015, Angie worked for more than 10 years developing employee and client training programs and communication resources for global companies, including Siemens Healthcare and Deloitte. I want to welcome Angela and let her go ahead and share her screen and begin her presentation on workplace biases in the workplace.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susan, and thank you all of you for joining us this morning. I know that since we are a large group, we have muted everyone just to avoid the barking dogs and other visitors that might otherwise come upon us. But I would love to have your questions and comments in chat, and I know that Shannon's going to monitor that for us, and we'll certainly have a few minutes at the end for me to kind of take a closer look there as well. So encourage you to pop in with chat, and I'll also post some questions as we go through today's presentation to add a bit of interactivity as well. So to get started, biases in the workplace, this is a very broad topic, right? So I recognize that some of you may be coming to this presentation with a couple of different expectations for what you're hoping to learn. So there are the general decision-making biases, and Mark mentioned one of those being confirmation bias, and we're actually going to talk about 5 common decision-making biases in organizations. But before we get into those kind of cognitive decision-making biases, I want to talk about the role of workplace culture in contributing to the formation and even solidification of some of those biases. So how does our workplace contribute to some of these? And conversely, how can we start to recognize when this is happening and say and do things to kind of combat or mitigate those biases affecting the decision-making that's happening in our organizations? That is an increasingly important consideration these days as our workforce does diversify, right? We currently have 5 different age-based generations in the workforce, and we're seeing a lot of the tensions and conflicts that are starting to bubble up in some organizations. The root cause of some of that is that we continue to kind of default to existing policies, default to existing cultural norms, and we have fresh perspectives coming into the organization and starting to question policies and norms and rules and implicit ways of doing things and thinking about things. And so we start to see, again, this combination of organizational culture and decision-making bias. So we're going to kind of tease out some of those things today. At the end of this session, I'll also invite you to an additional session that I'm doing in a couple of weeks that will be a deeper dive into race-related issues and bias that is currently a very hot topic in many organizations if you're looking for more of a deeper dive into that particular angle. So today's session, we'll talk about difference and bias. We'll talk about the role of workforce diversity in shaping decision-making, both why increasing workforce diversity means that we should be more cognizant of some of these default norms, and then the benefits of diversifying who's around the table and whose perspectives are allowed to contribute when we are making decisions. In terms of getting a better understanding of the opportunities there, we'll talk about 4 different types of generations in the workforce. So I just mentioned we have 5 different age-based generations. There's actually a couple of other types or forms of generations in addition to the age-based generations that we hear a lot about, right? The millennials and the baby boomers and the Gen Xers. There's some other forms of generations that are unique to our specific organization in terms of the role of organizational tenure, for example, how professionally diverse our organizations are, right? So do we have IT and marketing and human resources and engineering and manufacturing? How professionally diverse are we as an organization, and why is it important to consider that type of diversity in decision making as well? And then, as promised, we will talk about 5 common decision-making biases, and again, how those relate to organizational culture and workforce composition. And then we'll certainly close out offering some tips for both us as individuals and our organizations, particularly those of us that are in leadership roles, things that we can do to start ensuring that we are offering an inclusive and effective process for decision-making across the organization. Looks like we have someone waiting here. I'm going to admit them. So in terms of our workplace culture, right, I always like to situate this in this bigger perspective because it's very easy for us to kind of see decision-making opportunities and norms through our particular role, whether that's HR manager, engineering director, lawyer, right? We kind of, that is our primary decision-making bias at work. We are hired to represent that profession and contribute to professional, informed, expert decisions based on that profession that we have chosen and joined the organization to represent and advise. However, again, we're part of this much larger, more complex organization, right, that certainly is influenced by what's happening out in the world today. So this is where we start to see some of the tensions and potential conflicts that I mentioned around increasing diversification of our workforces. And so that requires an additional level of responsiveness and inclusion when it comes to decision making. That's trickling down into our organizational norms, cultures, policies, and certainly playing out in group and team communication, individual coworker interactions and conversations, and then our personal identities, right? We're becoming increasingly aware of the degree to which workplace policies, for example, are responsive to our specific needs, whether we are a parent of young children or we are an adult child of aging parents who we're also trying to help care for. I know I'm in this position personally. My father is getting to the age where he's starting to have some pretty significant health issues, and that's something that I'm involved in coordinating and worrying about on a daily basis, right? So certainly we don't check those worries and concerns at the door when we come to work, and it can also impact the type and amount of leave that we need to take from our job, right, to attend to those things. But yet we have some pretty standardized, even outdated policies around who qualifies for how much type of leave and those types of things. And so we start to see how our workforce diversification can contribute to some of these tensions up, down, and across the organization. So again, we're representing our profession. That is kind of the source of some of our biases when it comes to the workplace, but we're also interacting with a whole host of different individuals, departments, entities, both inside and outside our organization. And so recognizing what our biases are, both as an individual and as a professional, right, is really important as we go about our daily work. And we're stepping into these different roles, different teams, different types of decision making on a daily, even hourly basis, right, as we hop from meeting to meeting here on Zoom throughout our days, especially now. So some helpful, a couple of helpful definitions before we get too much farther into the content. So difference, what do we mean when we talk about difference? Well, this is ways that we can vary, right? So we certainly have our individual areas of difference around gender, age, profession, length of tenure with our organization, marital status, family status. All of these things, again, are a part of who we are, and we don't just leave those things at the door when we come to work or when we're making decisions at work. We also all have bias, which is an inclination toward or against a social category of people, or in the context of our topic today, for or against a certain decision in our organization. Bias can be helpful for us in that it serves as a cognitive shortcut that helps us quickly assess costs and benefits of a particular decision, right? So we might be biased toward a certain gas station, for example, and we need to fill up our car because it's on our way home or it's cheaper, right? And so maybe we'll actually drive a little farther to save 10 cents a gallon on gas versus, no, I'm going to choose my convenience bias and stop here even though it's going to cost me a little bit more. So in a very basic way, these biases can help us quickly make decisions, right, that aren't of significance. Of course, where this becomes problematic is where we are blind to the biases that are impacting more significant decision-making, particularly as it relates to our roles at work. And so just being aware that we all have bias, right? Oftentimes when we talk about bias, we talk about it as a negative thing. We might think, well, I don't have bias. But we all have bias, and that bias is a product of our upbringing, of our education, of the profession that we work in, right? It's just a thing that naturally occurs for all of us. And we can have, again, positive biases towards certain things or certain groups of people. A common example of where this might come up is in hiring conversations. If we're reviewing resumes and we see, oh, this person went to the same college that I did, or they grew up in the same area, or they live in the same neighborhood, that's a positive bias. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Where that can become problematic is if we are constantly hiring people who share those types of similarities with us, rather than looking purposely to diversify who we're actually bringing into the organization. We can certainly have negative biases that play out in our decision-making around hiring and other things as well. And we'll get into that as we go through today's presentation. So our biases are part of our mental models, right? So our mental models also form over time through our personal experiences, our education, the influence of our social groups and our families, and certainly in the context of work, our organizational cultures, right? So who's around us. If you think about maybe your first professional job, you might have had a mentor or a manager who kind of took you under his or her wing and kind of explained how we do things around here, right? And so that became to form, or that helped to form some of your initial biases around the way we do things around here, how we make decisions, who gets to have a major voice in decision, who does not, who's included at the table, who is not, those types of things. And so over time, we observe these things implicitly. We participate in the culture and shaping it, and we can start to become attached to some of these norms, right? If we were involved in making a particular policy or hiring a particular person, again, we might have a bias towards that person or towards that policy because it's our person or it's our policy. And so we can certainly be blind to those types of biases towards certain people or policies. And again, that's where some of this can become problematic. And certainly our mental models that we form influence our communication in ways that we don't always recognize. And so we can reflect our bias in how we communicate towards certain people, who we give a little bit more leeway to versus who we don't, right? So if it's a person that we like, that we hired, we might grant them a little bit more flexibility if they make a mistake versus someone that we haven't worked with before and therefore don't have that context of feeling we understand, well, they're just going through a tough time because of this or that, right? So certainly our biases are influenced by our organizational culture, and we contribute to that organizational culture through our own communication as well. So how does this start to connect to broader organizational culture? As I mentioned, there are 4 types of generations at work. And the one that we're probably all most familiar with is this birth cohort, or generations as they're popularly called, right? The baby boomers, the Gen Xers, the millennials, those age-based groups. So this has to do with when you were born, right? And the kind of broader social happenings that were occurring that kind of shaped your mental model about family, community, schooling, those types of things. However, we tend to create outsized influence to that age-based generation when it comes to factors at work, right? So there are a lot of age-based stereotypes that exist in the workplace, and I'm sure you have heard these in some conversations at work. And maybe we could actually pop this into the chat. I'm curious, what are, for example, some age-based stereotypes that you heard about younger employees, not necessarily in your organization, but in the world of work in general? These might be positive stereotypes or negative stereotypes. So if you want to hover, it's probably at the bottom, it might be at the top of your screen. There should be a chat feature. Anybody have examples of either positive or negative stereotypes about younger workers? Okay, lazy, they know everything about technology, right? So they're really good with technology. I know I've heard that one a lot. No company loyalty, tech savvy, but poor work ethic, right? So there's kind of that lazy, sometimes considered entitled, right? And so we can see here the influence of these stereotypes, right? So we're all kind of saying the same type of thing. They don't want to pay their dues. They don't want to work hard. They're lazy, right? But what this kind of misses, right, is this broader societal level impact. We saw that kind of nested circle model at the beginning of the presentation. It's important to realize with those particular stereotypes that the younger generation doesn't have the social contract related to work that those of us that are in the older generations have, right? And so I can say working in higher ed, younger folks in college right now are directly getting the message that you have to manage your career, you have to build your network, build your skills, and never get too comfortable, right? Because you can't expect that you're going to be in the same organization for your entire career, right? They've also seen parents and older siblings lose jobs due to mergers and acquisitions. And so because of these implicit and explicit messages, they are looking to build skills, build network, and kind of stay ahead of some of those broader societal factors, right? And so that's one dimension that we want to keep in mind. Certainly there are stereotypes about older workers as well, and I'm curious if you are familiar with any of those. If you've heard them, what might some of those be? Stereotypes about older, out of touch, unwilling to learn new things, right? Not as good with technology, right? So the reverse, my way or the highway, don't like change, right? Not liking change, being resistant to change is a common one. But conversely, if we think here about the broader social issues and organizational changes, by the time you get to be 40s, 50s, 60s, right? You've been around for a while, you've been through a lot of change. And so you can recognize when something maybe is going to end up to be what we often hear is the flavor of the month, right? That we know maybe one particular change isn't going to last very long because there's a lot of leadership turnover in this particular unit. And so we might be hesitant to get fully invested in any one particular change. Right, and so waiting for retirement, Rick mentions that one as well. And so that certainly can be an issue, particularly for folks that have that retirement package waiting for them, or they have been able to save up a significant amount of money. And so they're just kind of waiting, right? They're not going to make a career move when they're maybe just a couple of years away from retirement. So there are these very legitimate factors that are built into our organizations, built into the world of work that get blamed on our age, right? When in fact they are rooted in some of these broader societal trends or organizational cultural norms around these issues that we've been talking about. So that takes us to these next couple of generations at work. And the reason I'm talking about some of these up front here is that these factors around organizational culture and organizational composition start to contribute to some of our decision-making biases, right, and our defaults in terms of the norm for how we go about making decisions, which can become problematic because, again, our workforces are increasingly diverse and have different needs and different perspectives that can really be valuable. So our next type of generation at work is the workplace cohort. And this has to do with when you join the organization and how long you've been with the organization. So really relates to organizational tenure, essentially. So if you've been with the organization for 2 years, versus 10 years or 20 years, you've literally grown up in a different type of organization, right? Think of someone who's just joined your organization maybe in the last year, and how probably chaotic, uncertain, ambiguous this organization is for them. And if this is their first or second job out of college, oh my gosh, they don't have any footing to recognize what normal is, because they're just navigating this constant level of change and uncertainty. Versus if you've been with your organization for 10 or 20 years, you've been through some type of large organizational change or broader societal level impact to your organization, say the last recession back in 2008, right? This kind of feels a little bit like that. So we know that we're going to get through this one way or another. We still don't know how everything's going to play out, but we have that kind of framework, right? That's part of our mental model of what it means to work, that you have these periods of time that do tend to be highly uncertain and ambiguous. And so we have that as a mental model that we can kind of draw upon. Whereas newer, younger workers, they don't have that, right? And so they might be feeling particularly anxious about, you know, should I stay here? Should I quit this job? Should I look for another job? I don't really know what to do. And so certainly our workplace cohort also becomes part of our kind of go-to group, right? We typically stay friends with people, at least a couple of people that we go through new hire training with, right? Because of that bonding experience of going through either this difficult time of learning a new job or having really great positive experiences. If you're joining the organization during a high time, right, you kind of get bonded, and that becomes part of your in-group in the organization, right? People that you go to, that you tend to hang out with, people that you go to if you have a question about how should I handle this situation, or who should I talk to if I have this technical question, right? Those cohorts become very powerful, which can be a positive thing, but it can also be a negative thing, as we'll talk about in a little bit. And then the next type of generation is the incumbency group. And as I go through these, the question I'm going to ask here at the end when we get to number 4 is, which of these generational forms do you think has been most influential in your own career, in your current job? So the next group is the incumbency group. The incumbency group is who's around you when you either join an organization or join a new team, get promoted to a new role, for example. Those people that are directly around us in a particular role can also be very helpful, either in a positive way or in a negative way, right? So the example I like to give here is if you think about who was your boss when you first joined the organization that you're with, or you most recently got a promotion. Was that manager someone who was very helpful to you, that trusted you and said, hey, I hired you or promoted you into this role because I know you have the skills, knowledge, and expertise to get the job done. Go forth and do it. If you have any questions, if you need me to help you remove any roadblocks, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to trust you to go ahead and do it. That's a very different experience than if you work for a micromanager, right? Who says, here's the 5 things I want you to do, check the list, keep me updated, send me daily or weekly emails, right? Who tends to really micromanage, maybe even critique you more. That ends up being very limiting. And that can also be very, especially limiting for people that are new to the workforce, right? So if you join an organization and that's your first experience with a manager, that's really going to kind of limit your understanding or your willingness to take risk. And then that gets viewed as others sometimes as, well, that person doesn't want to work very hard. They just want to punch the clock and leave at 5. Well, any of us who have worked for a micromanager know that's true for any of us, right? If we're stuck in that type of situation, we don't want to stick around very long. So again, our incumbency group, it's not just our managers, it can also be our coworkers, our clients. Again, if we feel supported and we're getting to do really engaging, meaningful work because of who's around us, that's a very different feeling than if we're kind of stuck in a rut and micromanage. And then the 4th type of generation is not specific to the organization, but it's personal to us as individuals, and that's our life stage. And this can certainly affect our personal decision-making when it comes to work, how many hours we want to spend at work, how much additional work we want to take on in terms of volunteering for extra projects. And so this is one identity that changes over time, right? So as we get older, maybe we become married, or we have or adopt children, or again, we start assuming some level of responsibility for our parents who start having medical or even financial issues of their own. And so as we go through these life stages, right, we change our priorities again in terms of how much time we're willing to invest in work. Around the middle point, right, when we're getting into that manager role, potentially your first leadership promotion, we might be extra into taking on extra projects, stepping into more leadership opportunities. But then maybe as we get older, right, we start to see maybe retirement is on the horizon, or again, even a little bit earlier, if we're in our 40s or 50s, we might be in what's called a sandwich generation, again, where we might still have young kids at home and we're starting to help care for elderly parents. That is necessarily going to impact how much time and mental energy we have to invest in our work. And so I always like to mention this one is in that it's good to recognize that our colleagues, right, just like us, we all have multiple demands on our time. We can no longer kind of check our personal lives at the door as we could back in the baby boomer and even the older traditionalist generation, where there was typically one person in a partnership that was bringing home the bacon and the other partner was taking care of bills, taking care of kids, taking care of all the family stuff. Most homes are now having dual income, right? So both parents are working outside of the home in some way, shape, or form and trying to keep all the homestead things going. And so life's a lot more complicated. And so as we think about these 4 different generations, first, again, I'm curious which of these you think is influencing your current work experience. Is it your age cohort? Your workplace cohort in terms of how long you've been with the organization. You might feel this is an advantage or a disadvantage. Your incumbency group, so the people that are around you, your managers, co-workers, clients, or your personal life stage and kind of what you're juggling with there. So let's see in chat which one. Workplace, I'm going to assume that's a cohort maybe, so number 2. Workplace cohort, number 2, workplace cohort, incumbency group. Interesting. So those are the 2 organization-specific forms of generation, right? Although, while in general, right, we hear a lot in the media and even in our organizations around age-based differences, the millennials are this and the Gen Xers are that. When it comes down to it, and this is what I often hear when I ask this question, is that the greatest influence, either positively or negatively, is either the incumbency group or the workplace cohort. These groups are either fantastic resources for us or they're additional sources of stress or conflict that we have to manage. And so your responses in the chat here are kind of playing that out. So that is an interesting factor that we'll come back and talk about here as we talk a little bit more about workplace culture. Oops, looks like, oh. Okay, so the other reason that talking about those general types of generations are helpful is that, again, it helps us start to recognize that our decision making, both personally and then across our organization, is really impacted by who we are and what we bring to the organization, our perspective based on our profession, our perspective based on our number of years of service with the organization, as well as our personal background, right? Men compared to women, white employees compared to Black employees, right? We're all bringing different lived experiences and perspectives to our jobs, which there is a lot of research that shows workplace diversity, particularly diverse teams, actually are found to make more creative and effective decisions, because if we can harness the power of those different perspectives and really have a good decision-making conversation where everyone is able to share their perspectives, concerns, and ideas, the end product is going to be that much more effective for the organization, because we're taking all of those needs, not only for our employees, but also for our increasingly diverse customer and community groups into mind. But we have to work through these tensions, right, around organizational tenure, around hierarchy, right? So who's sitting at the table? Do we have a good mix of people who have been with the organization 2 years versus 20 years? Are we getting input? Are we seeking input, not just from people who have the title of director or vice president, but we are soliciting input from our customer service folks, other frontline employees who, again, based on their role in the organization or their life stage, right, might have different needs, perspectives, and experiences compared to people who have been with the organization longer or have the privilege of that leadership title and influence. We certainly do want to consider the fact or the impact of race and gender as well. I'll show you some research here that'll get us into those factors, but certainly for folks that are female in a predominantly male-dominated organization or industry, it can be very difficult not only to get a seat at the table, but to have your voice heard and your perspectives included in decision-making if you are a minority in that way. And certainly we know that the same holds true for race, particularly for Black women. It can be especially challenging, right? Because as you seek to move up in terms of career advancement, you run up against the stereotypes of both Black women, the stereotypes of Black women, but also the expectations for leaders. So if you are a Black woman, the main stereotype there is that if you are asserting yourself or strongly asserting a particular opinion perspective, you run the risk of running into that angry Black woman stereotype. But yet, if you are in a leadership position, you are expected to be assertive, to be a direct communicator. And so those expectations around roles and personal identity, right, can make it difficult for minoritized groups such as Black women to not only have a say in decision-making, but to advance in their career and bring that perspective to those higher level leadership positions. And certainly number 5 here, we talked about age as well, and we kind of did a nice job of pulling out some of those stereotypes. We can imagine if we think that younger employees, or some of our colleagues think that younger employees are entitled or older employees are just punching the clock, we may be less likely to invite them into certain decision-making conversations, right? Because we see them through that stereotypical lens. And so being aware of these stereotypes, we can all give voice to the fact that no, we should be seeking more diverse perspectives. We should be including the needs and expectations of constraints of everyone when we're formulating policies and those types of things. So that piece of research that I wanted to share with you, this comes from 2014. It's a research study out of the University of California at Hastings called Double Jeopardy, Gender Bias Against Women of Color in Science. And certainly we have a strong presence of the technical professions here in the Kansas City area. So this research is particularly relevant for us. These researchers interviewed about 100 women that work in technical and scientific professions, women of color in particular, as well as white women, about their experiences in navigating day-to-day workplace culture. And here are some of the top level findings and percentages that were shared. So one of the biases that came out here was called prove it again bias. And this is something that is experienced by women of all races and ethnicities, where particularly if you're working in a historically male dominated field, if you have success, it is assumed that you got help or that you got lucky, that this wasn't necessarily just specifically because of your competence, because of your expertise, but there were some external factors that really are what contributed to you being able to be successful in this project or to discover this scientific breakthrough. And so when asked if they had experienced this prove it again bias, 76.9% of Black female respondents said, yes, I have run into this. 64% of Latinas, 63% of Asian Americans, and 62% of white women. And so pretty high percentages for all women, right? And so again, this has to do with their minoritized status within their profession, within their organization, the norms for who is the ideal worker, right? Who's the person that makes the big breakthroughs. It historically in those professions has been men because those have been male-dominated professions. So it's going to take some time and some effort and some willingness for people to not default to that ideal image of who it is that is our top star performers, and also to break from some of the stereotypes that can exist about women professionals as well. The second column, we start to get into some of the communication challenges that women and women of color particularly can face. So when asked if they had experienced pushback for being assertive, so just making assertively stating an opinion or their professional expertise, Asian American women were most likely to experience this, followed by white women and then Black women and Latina women. I'm curious in the chat, why might we hypothesize that Asian American women would be the most likely to experience pushback when being assertive? More than white women or more than Black women? So Asian culture traditionally is known to have respect for authority, right? So it's unexpected for an Asian American woman to actually be assertive because that is not their cultural norm, and that's not our expectation for those of us that are white or other racial backgrounds. We don't expect Asian Americans to speak up, right? And so they're coming up against that stereotype, which then generates a negative evaluation of communication that violates that stereotype. Asians are expected to be smart but compliant by culture, right? So we have these stereotypes, right? There's the cultural norm within the Asian culture, but even more powerfully in this setting is the stereotypical expectations that the majority membership has for Asian American women. And so, right, they're coming up against these cultural stereotypes, but also the expectation that as competent scientific professionals, they speak up, right, and share their learning, share their expertise. Those two things come into conflict. And communication research would tell us that when there is what's called an expectancy violation, that the person that violates that expectation is evaluated more negatively, right? So that's a very difficult situation for Asian American women to be in. Third column here, who's asked to do more office housework? And by office housework, we mean scheduling meetings, arranging for lunch, serving coffee, making copies for meetings, right? The women that were asked about this, right, 41% of white women actually said they had been asked to do office housework. Black women, 37.5, Asian, 32.5. Now this finding might be counterintuitive, right? If we think about the influence of stereotypes of particularly Black and Latino women, right? We might think, why is it that white women actually reported being asked to do more office housework in the workplace? So what might we hypothesize here? Again, with this somewhat counterintuitive finding. Any thoughts? This one's a little trickier maybe. And there's not one right answer. So we have one here. Single parent household statistics. Okay, Amy, can you talk about that a little bit more? Traditional secretary role, so absolutely that can be, right, historically, because there were historically more white women in the workplace in the early years, right? Others might be more comfortable asking a white woman to do that, be more expecting of them to do that. In this instance, we might also be a little bit aware of our stereotypes, right? And that we shouldn't be asking Black or Hispanic women to be doing those types of things because those are stereotypical expectations. So folks might actually feel more comfortable asking a white woman to do that than a woman of color. Okay, oh, Amy, no problem there. So I think this is where we can kind of flip again the stereotypical expectations on their head, that we might be a little bit more conscious of them and therefore be a little bit less likely at least to ask perhaps a Black or Latino woman to do that. Although we still see for all racial groups statistics here in the 30 to 40% range. So this is something that a fair amount of women across racial categories are experiencing. But if you think about this, right, this is one snapshot, one study in time within a particular set of professions, and these are the things that these women are navigating, right, where they want to make contributions, they want to be involved in decision making, they want to contribute their expertise, yet they're experiencing pushback when they are assertive, when they are speaking up, when they are giving voice to the needs of their team or other individuals like them within the organization, whether that's a parent or a single person or a person that's balancing, trying to help care for elderly parents, right? That they're getting this pushback and that they are sometimes often still expected to fulfill these stereotypical roles of either not pushing back and or being willing to take on a disproportionate share of the office housework that needs to be done in organizations. And so this helps us make the point that we each experience workplace culture differently, right, based on our personal identities, as that research just showed us, but also when it comes to the organization, the level of privilege that we might have based on our organizational tenure, right? So if we've been with our organization for 10 or 20 years, we kind of do have a feel for what the norms are. Even if we don't have a influential job title, a formal position of authority, we probably have developed our informal network, right? So we might be good buddies with the director of marketing or the manager in human resources. And so we can kind of get our opinions or perspectives into the fore that way. And so we develop those more informal networks as well. And so just important here to think about when we think about why don't certain people speak up or why won't they share their perspectives, why don't they want to participate in decision making. These are some of the implicit factors that only the people that are experiencing them typically really fully appreciate. And it's upon the rest of us to start to notice these things, which is one of the reasons that I share that research about women in science professions. And so we are all navigating, we talked a little bit about intersectionality earlier, right? These are the different identities that we bring to work or that are placed upon us based on, again, our job title, our tenure, but also our individual social group identities, our gender, our race, age, socioeconomic status, family status. You see some of these at the bottom. As well. And so these are all things that can either grant us additional influence or privilege in our organization or serve to make it a little bit more challenging if we are in a minoritized group within the organization. So we're the only young parent on our team, or we're the only older male over 50 on our team, right? And so we've got to then navigate some of these implicit cultural norms. And so you can think about, based on that slide that I just shared, what are a couple of your identities that either give you a little bit of influence or even privilege, right? When we talk about privilege, sometimes that rubs people the wrong way.
So I'm gonna have you start over here on this side. I kind of did the 6 feet. Are you comfortable with that? Okay, all right. So now you're brand new.
Oh, it looks like
So
somebody
say
has
hi
their
to Taylor.
sound. And think about, again, what are a couple of your identities that give you influence in your team or in your organization? And I mentioned the concept of privilege, and again, sometimes that kind of makes people bristle, but all that is unasked for advantages that you get because of your role or your identity. So if you have a director level or vice president level title, that's going to give you privilege, right? You have the authority to make the final decision, versus if you're a frontline newer person, right? You don't have that particular privilege, but you might be a member of the majority racial group in the organization. So if you work in a predominantly white organization and you are a white person, it's going to make it a little bit easier for you than, say, an African-American colleague, for example, who might be the only Black person on their team and might be running up against some of those stereotypes we talked about. So I want you to take just a minute to think about what are a couple of your identities that grant you positive influence, and then maybe what's one or two that you notice are maybe making things a little bit more challenging for you or do in a particular situation. So looks like age and years of experience. Someone else mentioned being white, millennial, a new hire, and a non-parent. So let me back up and ask the question. Let's start with what's one example of an identity that you feel gives you influence or even a little bit of privilege? So we can make sure that we're all talking about the same thing here. So tenure, okay. And that can go both ways, right? Some organizations value the perspective of new people, right? And some people really value the perspective of folks that have been around and paid their dues, quote unquote, right? Title, yep, absolutely. You have that position of authority. That's really helpful. If we think about back before we had our title of manager or director or vice president, it gets a lot more challenging when we don't have that. Okay. Conversely, what's maybe one aspect of your identity that can make it challenging for you, at least in some settings or meetings, to voice your concerns? So looking really young, right? Thank you for sharing that, Julianne, right? And I think by that you're saying you actually look younger than you are. So people are attributing to you the younger stereotypes that you haven't paid your dues, or you don't really know as much as someone who's been in the organization, the profession for a while. Education level, Rod, thank you so much for sharing that, right? So I see that a lot in higher ed, even at KU amongst our staff, right? They have shared with me when I facilitated sessions like this with them that they are very aware of the fact that if they don't have a master's degree or a bachelor's degree, that they feel that their opinions aren't valued as much, because as an institution of higher ed, there's such privileging of formal education. Joe mentions being one of the younger members of a team, so absolutely, yep, if you're one of the one or two younger folks, it can make it challenging when everybody else is older and or has been around for a while. Laura, part of a team that was acquired by a larger company, and we haven't even talked about that, right? But then you have the merging of two entire sets of different cultural norms, right? And you're also the outsider coming into the organization. I've been through a large merger and acquisition, know exactly what you're talking about there. That definitely takes some time for not just you and your team to work through, but the whole organization to really come together and really question the way that both previous organizations have done things, and ideally create a culture where everybody can start creating new norms. Great. So we can all see that we've had this experience, or continue to have these experiences, right? In some aspects of our work, we're part of the in-group, the majority group, whether that's based on age or job title or organizational tenure. That helps us, makes it a little bit easier for us in many situations to share our perspectives. We're more comfortable speaking up because we know that we have others in the group that share our perspectives and will back us up. Conversely, if we are a member of a minoritized group in our organization, so there's fewer younger employees in our organization, or there's fewer salespeople. It's maybe an engineering-driven organization, or in the sales team, and so the engineers, because they're building the products, they really drive decision-making, right? That can lead us to feel that we're in this out-group. It can make it harder for us to first to have the confidence to speak up, and then secondly, to be validated and asked to expand on and contribute our ideas. So it's both relates to how we see ourselves on our level of confidence, but also how others respond to us, right? We make it, oh, you haven't been here long enough, or you've been around too long. And so these things can all kind of cut both ways. So when we talk about bias in organization, right, I like to talk not just about the abstract cognitive biases, but again, how our workplace cultures can really facilitate the existence of these biases and solidify them. And then conversely, we can start talking about what do we need to do to change things. So here are, to talk about some of those common decision-making biases, I've selected 5 of the most common. There are a lot of these. You can do a search online and see 10, 20, 50 or more of these different biases, but these are some of the most common ones that pop up in our everyday decision-making at work. One is the bias blind spot. So assuming that we are more objective than everyone else. So everybody else is biased, but I'm objective and I'm weighing all of the pros and cons and thinking about different perspectives and needs. So that's our personal bias blind spot. Number 2 is anchoring bias. So here we're weighing heavily, disproportionately heavily, the initial information or data that was shared in relation to a decision. And this can be information that's initially shared at the beginning of a project, right? If you're on a project team, evaluating which software vendor you want to go with, right? You might have the first company that comes in might have a very dynamic presenter, their pricing is right. And so, wow, that sounds really good. It was presented really well. And so that's kind of your go-to, the one you're kind of comparing everybody else with, right? This can also go farther back, right? So think about the current situation, decisions that we made as a leader or as an organization 6 months ago, given the business environment we were looking at then versus where we are now, right? If we're hanging on to those decisions that we made 6 months or a year ago for our department or organization, that might be very problematic for us, right? Given that things are continuing to change and all the uncertainty that we now have about the future. But that anchoring bias might cause us to say, well, no, we already looked at that information. We already made this decision. We already had this conversation. It's going to take more time and more money to go back and collect information, right? So really being caught on that anchoring bias. Confirmation bias, this is one that Mark mentioned at the outset and a really common one that you've probably all heard of before. This is where we seek information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. A common way that we see this outside of the world of work is in our social media behavior. We tend to like pages or connect with people that share our political views, right? And so we can end up in this echo chamber of people and organizations that are just feeding back to us our own beliefs and be missing different perspectives that might be valuable in helping us understand issues a little bit more broadly. That certainly plays out at work as well, right? So again, we like to think that we're a smart, competent professional or expert. And so we are going to seek out information from people or other sources that confirms that pre-existing belief in our assessment of a situation. Number 4 is availability bias, and this can be a problem when time is of the essence, right? Or when we have a group of people that have worked together before and have a high degree of trust. We'll just rely on information that those individuals provide. So who happens to be in the meeting when this need to make a decision pops up? Well, we'll just talk about this issue with who's here and go ahead and make a decision because that's the easiest thing, right? So that's availability bias. Information that's kind of quickly available on our computer, quickly available by who's in the room or other sources. And then finally, fundamental attribution error. This one's a little bit more complex, and this has to do with how we assess the reasons things happen to us versus the reasons things happen to other people. So when it comes to our own life experiences, we assume that when good things happen to us, it's because we earned it, while others may have just gotten lucky. So I've advanced in my career because I got my degree, or I've paid my dues, I've been here 10 years, or I'm really good at building relationships with other people. John is struggling because, well, he doesn't have his degree, or, you know, he can be difficult to work with, or he just doesn't think things through the degree that he should, right? And so that's something that he did wrong, right? And so that takes us to the flip side of fundamental attribution error, which is assuming that when bad things happen to us, it's due to external factors. When bad things happen to others, it's because of something they did or didn't do. Right? So if we're late for work, it's because of traffic, or because our child got sick as we were getting ready to run out the door, things that we didn't have any control over. But if a coworker or colleague is late to work, well, they should have planned ahead, they should have gotten out of bed sooner, those types of things. They should have left their house sooner. Should have accounted for traffic. And so we give ourselves a little bit more grace than we give others. Sometimes that's essentially fundamental attribution error. So let's look at some examples for how this can play out in our daily decision on the job. And again, as we talk about this, think about how this might combine with some of those personal identity factors that we were talking about earlier around tenure, around job title, around informal relationships, in-group and out-group status. So Which bias is it? Deciding whether to continue with a currently underway $1 million warehouse expansion that was launched to support pre-coronavirus business growth projections. Which bias is that? Anybody want to take a stab at that in chat? Yes, yes, Laura and David both. That is anchoring bias. Perfect, right? So it made sense 6 months or a year ago when we started the project. So we're just going to kind of keep on trucking. This also can be an example of sunk cost bias, which is another one where we say, oh my gosh, we've already spent so much time and money on this project. We have to keep going. And that is preventing us from saying, well, how much more are we going to lose if we potentially keep trucking down this path, rather than looking at the information that's currently in front of us or how our growth projections have changed. Number 2, getting angry when your direct report is late to an important meeting. Which bias is this? And I should say what might be the best choice, because for some of these we could probably make an argument that there's a couple of different things going on. But we say, oh my gosh, I can't believe she's late. She never plans ahead. Yeah, fundamental attribution error, right, Daniel? Absolutely, right? So, well, he or she should have left sooner. He or she should have looked at the weather forecast and knew it was going to rain and that was going to delay them. I did those things and I'm here on time. So failing to understand that or recognize that there may have been something completely unexpected that the person that's causing them to be late, right? And so that's a good example of fundamental attribution error. Number 3, sifting through a diverse group of resumes, deciding who to select to advance to the phone screen stage. There's a few different things that can come into play here, but you've probably heard some of the research that shows that, for example, individuals that are either female or have a Hispanic or African American name that someone assumes is Hispanic or African American are less likely to get a call back for that interview than a white sounding name. And so that is a reflection of bias blind spot, right? We don't recognize that we're doing that, but that certainly can come into play. I always think of an example here when I was working in HR. The director of recruiting shared with me that she had a small pile of resumes that were all from the same area of Chicago that was known to be a predominantly African-American neighborhood. And this manager had not chosen any of those qualified individuals to bring in for an interview. And so she rightfully had a conversation with him about that. And so that's a good example, again, of bias blind spot. He wasn't necessarily conscious that he was doing that, but he was engaging in some bias there. And then number 4, meeting with executives and HR leaders to determine whether the company should update your bereavement policy. Okay, so it looks like a couple of folks have said bias blind spot. So absolutely on an individual level, you could have bias blind spots thinking, well, this doesn't need to be updated because I haven't needed to use this, or when I had a death in the family, I was able to use bereavement policy. But now if we think about, again, increasing diversification of our workforce and their families, right? Family statuses, different types of families, that we might want to look at extending our bereavement policy to apply to different or a broader type of family type of relationships. And so that can be problematic. It could also be an example of confirmation bias, absolutely. Could also be availability bias, right? So in the example here, it says you're meeting with executives and HR leaders. We don't know, have we actually solicited input from a diverse group of our employees to see the degree to which the current bereavement policy is meeting people's needs, right? So if we talk to frontline employees, newer employees, to get their perspectives on how these policies might be more helpful for them. So availability bias would certainly apply here as well. Right, so there are the answers. And again, if we think about, again, these decision-making biases in the context of our increasingly diversified organizations, it's really important to recognize, again, who's in the room, whose voice is being weighted, and who's ultimately making the decision. And are we taking necessary steps to make sure that our mental models are accurately assessing the needs of our workforce, right? And so if we are surrounding ourselves with people who have been with the organization about the same amount of time, or in decision-making meetings where it's only fellow managers and directors and vice presidents, and we haven't gotten the perspective of younger employees, or also employees from different work sites, right? We haven't talked about that, but if you work in headquarters and you are a geographically diverse organization, are you getting input from folks at other sites? I know when I worked for Siemens Healthcare, I was in our US headquarters, and we would rightfully get complaints from our many other work sites, not just in the US, but around the world, that we were not seeking input on policies and resources specific to the needs of those different locations with different employee populations. Real quick, one of our examples of bias talked about bias in hiring. This can also play out in promotions as well. And so this was a study that was conducted by IBM and posted or shared on the Harvard Business Review, where they looked at the positive words and negative words that were used to describe men compared to women in performance reviews, and there were found to be many more examples of negative words used to describe women in these performance reviews as compared to men. And so we can think about, if these are the words that are being used more frequently, what is the impact that that's having on women's ability to get promoted? And again, if we think about the stereotypes of women in general, right, that we should be more collaborative, we should be more focused on helping others, rather than being assertive and direct in our communication, even though that's what we expect from more managerial leadership roles, right? We start to see the conflict between the implicit biases and our explicit expectations for who might be ready for a promotion. So how can we start to break through some of these biases, right? So embody an inclusion mindset. And when I say embody, I mean, when you walk into a room, particularly if you know a big decision is going to be made, be that person who's going to notice, kind of pull up to that 50,000 foot view out of your own perspective and kind of monitor what's going on, what are the dynamics in this room, who's in the room, who isn't, that should be, who's kind of dominating the discussion, what are some of these language examples and words that might be used to describe certain individuals or certain groups that are kind of turning the conversation in a way that might be problematic. And being the person to speak up and say that, especially if you have the influence of a formal position of authority. When you're staffing projects, particularly around decision making, make sure that you have diversity around the table and that you're supporting the voices of those individuals as decisions are being made. I'll show you some tips for this here in just a second. Number 3, notice who's participating. If you have a silent member, invite them in, right? You can also use a round robin strategy at the beginning or end of meetings to say, I'd like to spend 5 minutes going around the room and have everyone share a piece of input, a concern, or a question, right? So that everybody has that initial opportunity to share their voice. That's going to increase the chance that each person will then feel more comfortable speaking up, right? Rather than feeling the pressure to break into a conversation 20 minutes in, maybe they're the youngest or the newest person in the room. If we don't create that purposeful space for them to share, they may be less likely to do so. So to that point, we can also, again, particularly if we have the privilege of having that position of authority, be the person that says, that kind of verbalizes what's going on in the meeting. So I'm noticing that we're cutting off Kendra and Joan before they're finished. We've heard from Don and Paul, what do others think, right? So being the person that will step in and kind of call the group's attention to these things that we often don't recognize we're doing, right? And we're not doing them on purpose, but they are problematic nonetheless. At an organizational level, we can make more conscious choices about the need to potentially update policies and making sure that we're soliciting a variety of input for what might be more helpful around policies, processes, resources in the organization. Externally, it can also be helpful to expose your organization to different perspectives, and even more importantly, to invest time, money, and people power in those organizations, whether that's boards, whether that's professional associations, whether that's reaching out to colleges to do recruiting from different departments or different organizations, or maybe you haven't before, to help diversify those that you're bringing into the organization. And then also, as with the example I noted from my friend who was doing recruiting, again, have that 50,000-foot view about who's actually being selected by leaders and managers for development, mentoring, and sponsorship. So I hope this session was helpful. Again, the goal here was to kind of bring a deeper perspective to the concept of decision-making biases and look at the implicit, often unconscious ways we're defaulting to organizational norms based on who's in the room, who's in the organization, and whose voices are heard. So I hope this was helpful for you in thinking about how to be more conscious of those things and be the person who kind of organizes and speaks up for change. Some additional resources that I want to leave you with: we do have these monthly Link and Learns that I facilitate once a month through the KU Edwards campus. I know we're going to send out a copy of the slides, so I'll send you the registration link for these sessions as well. We'll be doing a deeper dive on the diversity and inclusion angle that I was kind of talking about here today on Thursday, August 20th. Generational differences coming up in October, so some hot topics there. I'm also doing a special session for those of you that are wanting to talk more about bias related to race and ethnicity and the issues and opportunities that that's bringing up in our organizations. I'll have a session coming up on August 11th. Then I'll make sure that we send out that registration link for you as well. And then, of course, if you're looking to make a more significant investment in your professional development, or you know someone who might be, we do have this 4-course graduate certificate and master's degree in organizational communication at the KU Edwards campus that I am the program director for. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about that opportunity as well. It's built for full-time working professionals. Our courses meet once a week online. So very sensitive to those of you that are juggling work, family, and potentially professional development. So thank you again for your time this afternoon. I know we're all super busy and in lots of Zoom meetings, so I hope this was helpful for you. If you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much, Angela. I want to say thank you for joining us, everyone, and thank you to Angela and Mark with Qualified Plan Advisors. We will get an email out to everyone with the information that Angela discussed, and we hope to see you at our Knowledge Now event next week, and then we will have another HR Roundtable in September. Thank you.